I'm Mari Ashby, and my guest this week, Jessica Lee, was a Conservative MP for Erewash for 5 years before standing down in 2015, and Graham Allen has been a Labour MP for Nottingham North for 30 years but is stepping down at this election. We'll also be joined by the Lib Dems and the Greens. But first, let's get your reactions, if I can, to some of this morning's headlines, starting with you, Jessica. The Conservatives' big announcement today is the promise of thousands of new council homes with hundreds of millions of pounds being invested. We need 20,000 new homes here in the East Midlands every year. That's just not going to be enough, is it, what they're promising?
I think it's a fantastic headline this morning. I'm glad it's come up this early in the election campaign as well, because it has to be a priority. It's not just the homes that are needed and are going to bring so much future for people, but it's the jobs and opportunities that go with that. In the East Midlands, we've got a proud history of building and apprenticeships in this area, and I think that there's going to be opportunities wholesale, not just obviously for the families and individuals moving in, but also for apprentices and for businesses going forward. So I'm really pleased with the announcement.
Michael Fallon was being rather vague on the Marr show this morning about if there would actually be extra cash for this policy.
Well, if Michael Fallon will know more than I do at this stage. But, I think with this election, I think people are interested in costings. We've seen already when Labour have got in difficulties with Diane Abbott and her announcement on policing. So I think people do want to know. So I think the emphasis will be on the Conservatives to explain how this is going to be funding. And I hope that they're able to set that out as soon as possible. OK, well, the manifestos, as we know, will be out next week. Graham Allen, is this another example of the Conservatives trampling on Labour territory when it comes to council houses?
Well, you'd think that having had 7 years in government that they'd actually know what they're doing on council housing and they'd know the numbers. But that appears not to be the case. They're making something up, I think probably because Labour was very clear in its announcement that there'd be 100,000 extra new council homes. But frankly, central government, whether it's Labour or Conservative, telling us what we have to do locally, you've got to listen to people locally. There's places where we can expand council housing and housing association. This party is
clearly trying to target Labour voters, isn't it, by doing this and following this policy?
Labour voters aren't stupid. They can see through this. And what I think Labour voters will be saying, and many voters throughout the country of all different complexions will be saying, leave it to the localities. My constituency of Nottingham North, that I'm now leaving, doesn't need any more housing. It's 90% housing already. We need more balanced community. Okay. Other areas can actually take more housing. So leave it to the localities and let's not have Labour or Conservatives telling us what to do from Whitehall. OK. Well, one big question that could have a major influence on this election is how many young people will turn out to vote. There's been growing concern at their lack of engagement in politics, but tens of thousands have rushed to register in time for the general election. Here's our political editor, Tony Rowe.
Friday morning, no, you're to blame for what happened.
A year ago, this student was in Ashby telling Boris Johnson what he thought about Brexit. At 17, Will Taylor had no other say than that. But now he's old enough to vote in his first general election.
I'm lucky I've been brought up in a background where political is a thing in my house. But I don't think in everyone's house, no one gets the same upbringing. I think in school, current affairs maybe should be on the curriculum.
There's concern from the Electoral Commission that 3 out of 10 18 to 24-year-olds are not yet registered to vote, and many may have fallen off the electoral roll since the system was changed to make each individual register. Since last summer's EU referendum, 750,000 people have turned 18. There is concern not enough of them have registered to vote in this election, and they've only got a week left to do it.
What we'll do is we'll head up into polling district D this afternoon.
There've always been young political activists. These University of Leicester students are giving up their spare time to campaign for the Conservatives.
Whether it's just reading the news occasionally or seeing the news on Twitter in the morning, it's vital that young people get involved in politics. It's just important to young people as it is to all age groups.
Them being the youngest, they're going to live the most, so they need to be involved in politics because it's their future.
Out on the streets of Nottingham, it's young Labour activists, and the polls show new voters are more likely to vote Labour. The party see getting that support as a way of upsetting the predictions.
Even if you're not going to vote for a party which I would support, it's still critical that people come out and vote. And actually, the more young people are involved, all parties, which not just Labour, all parties will have to listen to them and maybe reconsider some of their policies and target some of those policies to win those younger voters over.
You know you're getting old when politicians look younger. In Mansfield, Katie Atherton is a director of a growing media company. She's been a Labour district councillor since her early 20s, but she's quitting. Politicians, she says, get too much abuse.
People don't want to say anything wrong or do anything wrong to get negativity. And if you kind of nail your colours to the flag and say, well, do you know what, I'm from this party and I'm from this party and that's me, you are 100% going to get people that disagree with you.
So what about those who don't engage with politics or politicians? We asked the Prime Minister, who was campaigning this week in Mansfield.
Opportunities that they've got for the future, our future prosperity, depend on what happens over the next 5 years. That's about getting Brexit right. It's also about taking the country beyond Brexit. So I would say this is an important election because it will have an impact on them. It matters for them because it's about their future.
The priorities for each generation are likely to be different and will affect how they vote.
Labour offer things for young people. They don't offer much, and you could say, people do say it's the lesser of two evils, but I struggle to find, and I have looked, I struggle to find of what Conservatives do offer for young people.
Well, is this the party of aspiration, the party of bettering yourself, the party of low tax and the party of aspiration?
Of course, being registered to vote is one thing. Another is connecting with young people enough to get them out of their homes to the polling stations.
Well, we're joined now by Matthew Hulbert, a Liberal Democrat in Leicestershire, who is the chair of the party's Friends of Youth Services Group. Welcome, Matthew.
Thank you.
We have spoken to young people who voted Lib Dem in 2010 and who basically say they wouldn't vote again for your party because of your infamous U-turn on tuition fees. This is still your biggest problem, isn't it?
It is, and it wasn't our finest hour. I voted against the rise in conference, but democracy, it went the other way, and the party did that in coalition. All we can do now is try and say to young people, yes, that was a mistake, I admit it was a mistake, but the future now is all about Brexit, and many young people are against Brexit, and the Liberal Democrats are the only mainstream party that are fundamentally against Brexit, that say we accept the original result, but that set us off on a direction of travel. We don't know from the Prime Minister really any details in terms of this negotiation that she's going to do with the European leaders. And, you know, the older generations that predominantly voted for Brexit, I'm afraid, will be those that have to live with it for the shortest amount of time. Those that have to live with it are those young people. And so I would say to them, whatever mistakes my party may have made in the past, if you're against Brexit, your only option on June 8th is to vote for the Liberal Democrats.
Of course, Labour are now committing to abolish tuition fees if their draft manifesto is to be believed, so they're hoping to cash in on that. Matthew, Katie Atherton, who was in Tony's piece, went into politics and is now stepping down because of the abuse, she says, not just on social media, but she found the whole process of politics in Mansfield very gladiatorial. And she says that's putting people off.
Politics is a tough old game, isn't it? And I was a councillor for 4 years, and you know, when you're a politician, an elected representative, an MP or a councillor, you have to make decisions, and some people agree with those and some people don't, and some people are very vociferous, indeed occasionally a tad rude in their opposition to what you do. To a certain extent you have to take it on the chin, because that is kind of part of what you're going to get if you stand for election. But by the same token, I think social media, and you know, I'm on Twitter, most of us are, you are, Mary, it's very easy to be angry about something and to go and to type it in and it's sent away. Instead, you should have a breath, have a thought, think, would I say that to the person to their face? If not, don't type it. Don't be nasty on social media.
OK, Jessica, maybe it isn't in the interests of the Conservatives to encourage young people to vote. I mean, after all, we do know that research shows that the younger you are, the more likely you are to vote Labour.
Well, that might be right, but I've always been consistent on this. I feel very committed about encouraging people to register to vote from the earliest possible opportunity, from the earliest possible age, and to make sure that people do take an interest and vote. Obviously, I would say that the earlier that you take an interest, I would like to think that Conservative policies would appeal, and obviously that's the responsibility of Conservative candidates to do that. But be that as it may, I think this country, it's about the future. It is, you're voting for the next 5 years now.
And that's why
anybody who's just becoming to voting age now, there's such an important 5 years coming up. And I don't just mean Brexit, although of course that in part, but domestic policies as well. This is their future. I really encourage people to register.
But you stood down, didn't you, after just one term? In a way, you walked away from a career in politics. You know, were you disillusioned? Will people see that, as a...
I hope not, no. I mean, I think public services, it's a brilliant thing to do. You know, it's a real privilege and it's a real pleasure. And I also don't think that anyone should be compelled to do it for whatever reason. It's about choice. And, and I think that's a really important message as well. For me, it was about serving my community, doing the best I possibly could, also for my party and for my country for the time I was there. So I would say, make sure you vote, and if you want to, make sure you stand.
So how do we make this happen, Graham Allen? Because in 1992, 63% of 18 to 24-year-olds voted. In the last election, that had dropped to 43%. We all know how important this vote is. How are you going to bring it home?
Well, I'm standing down, of course, while I've still got some of my youth left to expend. But seriously, we need to make politics more user-friendly generally, above all for women, but also for young people. But that includes things like, for example, as you say, getting people involved. Let's be a bit tougher on this. Let's say if we can drop the voting age to 16, which I'm in favour of, that then it should be mandated. You're going to go and vote, even if you go and spoil your ballot paper. Let's make sure, as something I've campaigned for a long time, we have online voting, so young people don't have to take a day off work or college, but they can vote from the comfort of their own
more attractive.
PC if they so wish. Let's also stop this idea that somehow young people are different to everyone else in the issues they care about, whether it's the environment and global warming, the state of our food, the state of global multinationals evading tax, and the idea that young people don't have a job to go to, that we actually just throw people out of school at the end of the day and hard luck, fend for yourself. These are issues that are of real concern to everyone, above all young people, and we need to respect that by making sure that we're also getting the mechanics right to allow them to enter our politics easily.
Not to patronise them, OK. Would you support mandatory voting?
I would support mandatory voting as long as there was an option of none of the above. I think you would have to have that for mandatory voting. But I think Graham is absolutely right that young people care about a range of issues. You say I'm chair of Lib Dem Friends of Youth Services. Youth services, so these are youth clubs, etc., run by councils, have been cut up and down the country by local by local councils. But when you say to the local councils, why have you felt you need to do this? They blame, I have to say to my Conservative friend here, they blame the budget from central government, and it's vulnerable young people especially that suffer when these services go. It's shameful.
There is some hope, of course. Almost 60,000 young people registered to vote.
Which is phenomenal, and there's still time, I believe, to continue to do so before this election. But I agree, it absolutely should be votes at 16. The fact that some young people in Scotland can vote in some elections but not in others, giving people the mandate, the franchise, and then taking it away from them, shameful again.
OK, thank you very much, Matthew Hulbert. Now, it's the most marginal constituency in England. Just a few dozen votes separated the Conservatives and Labour in 2015 in Derby North, with the Tories coming out as the narrowest of winners. Well, now the Labour candidate is back, convinced that a full-blooded backing of Jeremy Corbyn's policies will win the seat. Helen McCulloch reports.
3 and 8, 38. 7 and 8, 78.
Elections are a numbers game.
5 and 7, 57.
Not even a general election gets in the way of bingo at the Jubilee Club in Chaddeston. But what will the voters be focusing on when they decide who they want in Maggie's Den?
NHS. It's on its knees now. It's only going to get worse, isn't it?
NHS is stretched, schools are stretched, all services, houses, immigration.
No beds, no nurses. People are going to die.
Derby North is a tricky constituency to predict. It's gone back and forth between the Conservatives and Labour. Throughout the 1980s, it was held by the Tories, and under Tony Blair, Labour won it back and clung on here until 2015. At the last election, it was the only seat in the East Midlands to change, swinging back to the Tories by a whisker.
It's all around celebrating what is great in the city of Derby, but also recognising what it is that we need to do. And 2 years just hasn't been enough. I've really tried my best. I've been doing lots and lots of things, but I would just like to have more time to do even more. There is Brexit, clearly, you would expect that. But there are other things as well around education, mental health, very, very close to my heart. I'm just hoping to be part of the government that does so much for mental health.
So what will happen this time round? Well, it certainly won't be a victory for the Greens. They're not standing here, instead choosing to support the Labour candidate, who they say shares some essential values.
It's probably the best manifesto we've had since 1945. As you look back at the 1970s, working class people like I was then, as a 19-year-old apprentice bricklayer, I was earning enough money to buy a brand new 3-bedroomed house in a desirable village. That's impossible in this day and age. We've got people sleeping on the street. We've got over 1 million people reliant upon food banks, 0-hour contracts, insecure employment. We need to give people hope again. A Labour victory here will be a pathway to a Labour government which will transform the lives of people in this city.
UKIP say they need to be in Parliament so they can ensure Brexit goes ahead.
We have got to be there to make sure we get the right result in the negotiations. She's already changed her mind about when there was going to be an election. She's already changed her mind about whether or not they're going to increase national insurance contributions. So what's to stop her now changing her mind on Brexit means Brexit?
There are many people here who know how important it is for businesses like Rolls-Royce, like Bombardier, like Toyota locally, to have access into the single market. People will have to consider what's most important to them, and whether it is the NHS or whether it is our relationship with Europe or whether it's funding for education, and people will have to compromise.
It's eyes down for the general election in this marginal constituency. If history is anything to go by, whoever wins here can look forward to a full house in Parliament.
Well, we're joined now by Sue Allender from the Green Party. Welcome, Sue. It's interesting that in Derby North, the Greens aren't fielding a candidate to boost the chances of the Labour candidate there. And in Mansfield too, you're stepping aside to let Labour hoover up that anti-fracking vote. What does that mean, though, for people who really want to vote Green and really feel that you're not giving them a chance to have their say?
Well, we think we are giving them a chance to have their say, but unfortunately, a Green vote in those particular constituencies is not going to be successful. There are obviously constituencies in the country where a Green vote will be more successful, and what we'd like to see is those other parties cooperating with us so that they stand down. Because I understand we've stood down in 22 different constituencies across the country, and that is because we want to give people a chance to vote for those policies, because we think it's policies, yes, not personalities, that are important in elections.
It's interesting, isn't it, the tactics that are being played.
Yeah, and we agree that there is more equity, there is more sharing in this latest Labour manifesto, and they are things that we really feel are important. And of course with the fracking and other aspects of the environment, although of course a Green vote is the only one if you are concerned about the environment.
So would Labour stand down then in favour of a Green candidate on certain?
I think what we're hearing is this noise from outside that our politics isn't fit for purpose, our parliament isn't fit for purpose, and above all our electoral system is not fit for purpose. And frankly, all of those non-conservative parties will now have to consider proper alliances very, very seriously. And the way to do that is not just moments before a general election, which incidentally we were promised that there was a fixed term, and that was just done away with by Mrs May, but actually to deal with creating a platform, if you like, an anti-conservative platform, which Labour, Liberals, Greens and others agree to support each other so that we get a majority. And when you've got the majority, only then are you going to be able to change the electoral system to a fairer one, so that we hear the voices of the Greens, we hear the voices of UKIP and the Lib Dems properly, and we form alliances then, not have a winner-takes-all system, which is bad for all of us.
There is a lot of talk, as we know, about coalitions. Jessica Lee, Theresa May famously described the idea of the anti-conservative parties aligning as a coalition of chaos, but an alliance of all the opposition parties, that could be quite formidable.
Well, I just totally disagree with trying to manipulate voters and not giving them choice like this when it suits political parties. I mean, I remember back, if I just finish
5 years with the Liberals.
Just let me finish. No, that was to create a government. That was not in the run-up to manipulating voters, not giving them choice beforehand. If I could just finish the point, the Labour in the high days of the Labour government, the President Blair, and I don't remember Labour then suggesting that there be alliance of other parties. I think the British people don't like being told what to do, and they like choice. And I just think that there's going to be quite a bit of scepticism and disappointment by people who do support different political parties if they're not given that choice. I think political parties should, if they can, field as many candidates as possible.
Sue Allender, I know you're desperate to say something.
I quite agree with that, because what we we actually want to form alliances on is not to give people choice. It's the opposite. So our party voted at conference, because all our policies are voted through at conference by the people who are members, and we voted that the only reason we want to form alliances is so that we can then have another election on proportional representation, so that people's voices are actually heard, because now people that vote, their voices aren't heard, because a lot, 48% of people voted against coming out of the European Union, for instance. Their voices aren't being heard at the moment.
Well, under the coalition government, there was, of course, a referendum for this country about whether we're going to change our voting patterns, and people don't want to do that. I think that, I think it's better to be consistent about this, and I hope the Conservative Party do remain consistent about this, which is to give every constituency as many different political parties as possible and give people choice instead of trying to manipulate voters.
So when you win under any system, it's a good system. But actually, that isn't the truth. We all know there's a better way of doing our politics than winner takes all, shouting at each other at Prime Minister's questions, and having an all-powerful Prime Minister who isn't directly elected. People should elect their representatives locally, not say it's some sort of surrogate for Mrs May or Mr Corbyn or anybody else. That way you'll have a strong Parliament which will hold to account a properly elected government. And to get to that position, you're going to have a change in the electoral system, because you won't change it under the current system. So that will require everybody getting together and putting our country and our politics ahead of pure partisan party games.
So are you worried that green issues are not going to be heard in all of this? Because we know that we've got some of the worst air pollution in the country, in our cities here in the East Midlands, and fracking, of course, is looming on the horizon. Lots of applications here in the East Midlands.
That's right, yeah.
Early stages.
Can I just say that the vote on proportional representation was not a vote on proportional representation, because AV is not in any means proportional representation proper, which they have in virtually all other countries in the world. And onto the green issues, well, people have been talking a lot about young people, and certainly this is something that's important for young people. And we're the only party that believes that we've only got one planet, which is a scientific fact, whereas the other parties seem to think that we have 3 or 4 to live on. And so the environment is vitally important, and we really need to have that discussed. And sadly, it is not discussed very much in this election.
Well, thank you very much.